The French are sort of pretty good at this game. The purchase of engines often dictates the purchase of aircraft. They have already got one foot in the door to selling Rafale aircraft which are powered by similar engines. France knows that if those engines come into the Indian military or to the Indian defense industry, then the United States aircraft, the F-A-18, will not be far behind.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining us today is Mr. Ajai Shukla. He has served as the Strategic Affairs Editor of the Financial Daily, Business Standard. Earlier, he served in the Indian Army and retired as a colonel after commanding an armored regiment. Mr. Shukla, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you, Usama. A great pleasure to be here.
All right, Ajay, let's go ahead and start our conversation. And my first question is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting France on Thursday, and the French government has gone ahead and given clearance to a French company, Saffrun, to design, develop, manufacture, and certify jet engines which can potentially be used by Indian Air Force aircrafts and Indian Navy aircrafts on its naval aircraft carriers. The question is, why are the French interested in making this deal or offering this deal at this point?
Well, as you would be knowing, France has a sort of a fine tradition of manufacturing defense equipment, defense goods, whether they are submarines, whether they are fighter aircraft. France has assiduously cultivated its own defense industry, and it does so by making sales to countries like India, since its own armed forces have a limited capacity to absorb defense equipment. A big, large country like India with a large army, and for that matter, Pakistan, they come as welcome customers that will buy defense equipment from the French, and at the same time, it serves as a large market that makes up for the cost of developing that defense equipment. So France has always, and this has been especially so in the last few years, cultivated India as a sort of a very large market, a strategic partner that will buy equipment from the French, and as we mentioned just now, pays for the cost of developing at least some of that equipment. Now, when Mr. Modi went to France in 2015, it came as a big surprise to many, but he then bought 36 Rafale aircraft, which is something that the French defense industry and Dassault, the company that makes the Rafale, was extremely grateful for, because it took up the cost of development, and when I say took up, I mean it compensated for it, and it was something that the Indian military needed as well. Now, those Rafales have been delivered, and the focus is now on aero engines, because with the large number of aircraft that the Indian military is buying, the aero engines come as a very large part of that component of that defense expenditure, and they are hoping that by making the cost attractive, and by making the sort of international traffic on arms regulations easy for India, they would be able to make a lot of sales and sort of become sort of key component of aero engines supplier to India.
But Ajay, the question is that Saffrun is definitely not a stranger when it comes to India. It does have a lot of footprint in India, especially in Bangalore and also in Hyderabad. The question is that since the United States has also made an offer to the Indian Navy for its aircraft carriers of F-A-18 aircraft, what kind of an impact, if a deal does culminate, would it have for the F-A-18 aircrafts?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer lies in one simple fact, that the purchase of engines often dictates the purchase of aircraft. For example, if India does go ahead and buy or sort of allies itself to the production of FECMA engines, Saffrun engines, which is what France is offering India, then they have already got one foot in the door to selling Rafale aircraft, which are powered by similar engines. It's an M-88 engine, it's called, and it's made by the French company Saffrun. And they are now hoping that while India has agreed with the United States on the purchase of F-404 and F-414 engines, both these engines are made by the US company General Electric. India has agreed to get those. But France knows that if those engines come into the Indian military or to the Indian defense industry, then the United States aircraft, the F-A-18, will not be far behind because it's essentially powered by those same engines. So it's really a proxy sort of battle that is going on. France is trying to overtake the United States on the engine track, and it remains to be seen whether India at the end of this trip will continue to ally with General Electric and buy the F-404 and F-414 engines, or whether they will switch to the M-88 engines of Saffrun, which will then make them most likely to get Dassault amphibious aircraft as well.
So on the face value, it would not be wrong to conclude that the French are actually trying to outcompete their American peers or American competitors.
Oh yes, the French are sort of pretty good at this game, and I should just sort of draw your viewer attention and the viewers' attention to the structure of defense sort of sales internationally. The United States is not sort of essentially buying and selling defense equipment in order to make its industry viable, for the simple reason that its industry is already very viable because it's the key supplier to the very large U.S. Defense services. The U.S. defense services are by far the largest in the world, so their defense industry already gets orders or already has sort of a big bank of orders in place. And the decision about who to sell to and how much to sell rests more on strategic reasons than on the economics of defense equipment. So even if what I'm trying to say is that even if the United States is not able to sell equipment to India, it is selling so much equipment to its own defense services that it is perfectly viable. Whereas for the French, it becomes a life and death situation almost, the need to sell equipment abroad, because its own military is a small military and can absorb only a certain amount of equipment. So for that reason, France is allied, it allies itself with India. It wants to cultivate the Indian market, and their equipment quality is so good that it actually manages to do so.
So Ajay, staying on the question then, in a recent visit to Washington, Hindustan Aeronautics and the General Electric did conclude a deal for use of jet engine in MK-2 Tejas aircraft. But the problem is the deal does await authorization by the US government. If there is a delay, and if there is a longer delay, would India somehow be looking elsewhere to get the jet engines from other players or suppliers in that case?
Usama, it's hard to predict what will happen in this sort of very tight negotiations that take place over defense equipment. But the arrangements for engineering, I would use this non-existent word, engineering the Tejas aircraft is already very much in favor of the United States. From the time that the first Tejas first flew in 2001, it has been flying only with GE F404 engines, and the same engine's improved version, which is the F414, is likely to power the Tejas Mark II. I think that France's sort of hope appears to be not so much the Tejas aircraft, Mark 1, Mark 1A, and Mark 2, but India's next generation of aircraft, which is the advanced medium combat aircraft. It's a fifth generation aircraft. It's being developed by India's DRDO, and they're hoping to sell engines for that aircraft. That is a new generation of aircraft that will come. So which what authorizations come through, what authorizations are actually availed of by India will dictate some of this. Now, it is it's not really the case that America has that the decision will be taken purely by the American government alone, because there are commercial decisions that are taken by the United States defense industry, which dictate eventually who will sell what and who will receive what. What I'm trying to say is that General Electric, which makes the 414 engine, is not going to decide just on the basis of the US government sanctions who it will sell and whether it will sell India or manufacture the F414 engine with India. This is a very sort of difficult commercial decision, because a company like General Electric will have spent a vast amount of money, literally billions of dollars, in developing that 414 engine. So there are hard commercial issues at stake over here. And just because the United States government says so, it's not going to dictate that beyond a point. It is true, as you say, that the ITAR sanctions and the US government sanctions are a must, but they are just one component of the decision. The actual decision and the hard component of the decision is, commercially, is it viable and profitable for GE to sell those engines to India? And if it is not, then the US government can do what it's like. This is a commercial decision, and GE will go ask for that.
So now coming on to the next platform, and there has been an ongoing discussion about procuring the Predator drones from the United States by India, particularly 31 drones if we add up the total number. How could such platforms be used in future crises and conflicts by India?
The 31 Predator drones that we're talking about are actually of two different types. There are 16 of them that are called the Sea Guardian drones, and there are 15 that are called the Sky Guardian. The Sea Guardian, as the name would imply, is used over oceanic territories. That is to say, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean. And the 15 Sky Guardians are used for land territories, which is, let's say, the India-Pakistan border or the India-China border. The sort of surveillance of India's oceanic territories, and it's got a huge amount of oceanic territory, 2.5 million square kilometers. That is currently being done by a fleet of 12 Poseidon P-8I aircraft, which India has bought from Boeing. Now, these are very, very capable aircraft. They are used by the US Navy itself. They're used by the Australian Navy, the British Navy. So they are right up there as sort of top of the rung aircraft. But they, again, they are just 12 aircraft. And for covering the whole Indian Ocean region with 12 aircraft, it becomes difficult. So these 16 Sea Guardian drones will actually join with the 12 P-8I and then give a sort of a greater or an enhanced coverage of the Indian Ocean to make sure or to ascertain what countries like China are doing in the region. Similarly, the surveillance of the land border with Pakistan and with China, it's very difficult to do that with India's current resources. So these 15 Sky Guardian drones will be a great asset in ensuring that that is done. So these are really not weaponized platforms. These are more surveillance platforms. And it should also be borne in mind, it is one thing for the United States to take Sea Guardians or Predators and use them over territories like Afghanistan where there's no opposition. When we're talking about the India-Pakistan or the India-China border, these are highly militarized, very sort of dangerous areas for drones to operate in. An aircraft like an F-16, which Pakistan uses, or an aircraft like the JF-10 or the J-10 or J-7 that China uses, will easily bring down a drone. There is, those drones have nowhere to go. These aircraft are aircraft that go in Mach 1.5, Mach 1.6, and they sort of don't give much of a chance for drones to operate. So, we need to keep this context in mind. Otherwise, people get the impression that now drones are coming. So just as the United States is shooting down any target it likes in Afghanistan or Yemen, India will be able to do it, or China will be able to do it. No, these are countries with powerful militaries operating in powerful military sort of contexts, and to that extent, the uses of drones are to be treated with greater care.
But Ajay, the question is that the platforms that we're speaking about, the Predator drones, these particular drones can definitely be armed. So the question is, if they are certainly to be operationalized, and since they can be used for kinetic reasons, isn't there then a question that, yes, they could be deployed in certain kinetic roles, even as you just pointed out, that the possibility or the liberty with which they can actually operate would definitely be under difficult circumstances, and they would not have as much liberty as when they're deployed in places like Afghanistan or Yemen.
Oh, well, I sort of apologize if I gave the impression that they can't be used anywhere. They can. There are certain areas where uses are possible, but broadly speaking, let's say a Chinese drone takes off from Lhasa or from Shigatse or one of the other sort of Tibet airfields that China has, and it comes towards India's border and is picked up by Indian surveillance means, whether those are radars, whether those are air defense guns, or whether they are drones like the Predator. For an Indian fighter to take off from, let's say, an airfield like Tezpur or Bagdogra in the northeast of the country, it will fly several orders of magnitude faster than the Chinese drone. It will reach the Chinese drone much before the Chinese drone can sort of think in terms of fulfilling its mission, turning around and going back to base. And to that extent, the survival of that drone becomes a big question mark. The same is true of Pakistan and India. The same is true of Pakistan and China. So, you can have limited uses and sort of cases where you use an element of surprise to allow the drone to get away with scot-free. But it's a very, very difficult proposition, and it's much it's very difficult or it's not advisable to compare the sort of the US Yemen context or US Afghanistan context with what we have in South Asia.
Ajay, of course, Americans are not the only one that are actually offering drones on the shelves or drones in the international market. And of course, they take their technology sharing or, selling their platforms to partners that are reliable. What other drone platforms do you think India could perhaps procure from other international actors?
India is not looking only at international markets for buying drones. There is a very sort of vibrant electronics industry in India, particularly in the south of the country. And there is a sort of concerted effort being made for India to make its own drones, to sort of manufacture, to design, develop, and so on, which is not too difficult because India's software industry is a very capable one. So I think, and this is my personal opinion, you will see a lot more in the future of Indian indigenous drones, starting from smaller drones that are shoulder-launched infantry platoon serving drones and so on, to the larger and the medium-sized drones. So I would say that these current assets that are being bought by India are probably just a sort of an interim solution to make sure that you have your surveillance in place and so on. But for the future, I think the Indian military is going to be relying to a much greater extent on its own drones.
But Ajay, the question is that India has also previously procured drones from countries like Israel. Do you think there's a possibility that India could be looking at the international market again towards Israel or other international players to enhance its drone capability, apart from, as you just mentioned earlier, relying on building up its own indigenous capabilities?
Yes, there's no doubt India will be looking at all the various options that exist. Israeli drones, as you mentioned, is just one of those options. There would be others like Turkish drones and so on also, which sort of India might at least sort of take a look at, if not actually buy. I would think that keeping in mind the sort of Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-sufficient India initiative that Prime Minister Modi has put in place, the chances are that India's drone purchases will hereafter be aligned more towards indigenous drones, especially from the point of view of the smaller and the medium drones. And the larger drones they will get right now from the United States and similar countries. But eventually, over a period of time, the Indian requirement will be met, I think, by large Indian drones as well.
Ajay, also, talking about the drone deal and the possible drone deal on the Predator drones, there has been criticism from the Indian political party Congress, which has criticized the deal, labeling it that it's not just only costly, the technology that's being used is outdated. The question is, why has this been the case that Congress is criticizing this deal at this point?
Politics, Usama, politics. This is sort of a combination of two or three things. Number one is that any defense purchase can be criticized for various reasons, that it costs too much, that it doesn't deliver sort of capabilities that are required at the current moment, that it is bought from a country that may impose sanctions and end user sort of curbs on the equipment. So there are many ways to skin a cat, and there are many ways to criticize a defense purchase. I would not take any of this too seriously, because I think within the sort of Indian public at large, there is a broad appetite for enhanced defense spending. There is a sort of broad belief that the government is more or less sort of honest in purchasing defense equipment, and therefore, while it's okay to play politics and to sort of issue criticisms of various kinds, this is not something that they would believe should bring down a government. So in my opinion, you will hear a lot of criticism and a lot of sort of noise over these defense purchases, but the purchases themselves will continue. Some of them from foreign sources, some from Indian sources and indigenous companies. And at the end of the day, I would not imagine or believe that any of this is going to stop the buildup of Indian weaponry as it's continuing in the present moment.
But Ajay, on one of the electronic media entities in India itself, while you were commenting on this issue, you did say the government's own decision to, put in place restrictions on imports itself is actually forcing the government to go ahead and expedite this deal. Could you just explain us or walk us through what the restriction is and why is the government in such a haste to actually go ahead with a deal like this?
Yeah, sure. The government's wish to curb imports of defense equipment is a combination of 2 or 3 different sort of imperatives. The first imperative, of course, is that being a right-wing nationalist government which likes to play up its own muscularity, the government would sort of prefer to give the impression to the people that it is building up its own defense capabilities and therefore is buying from its own companies. The second reason is, of course, that buying from abroad and sourcing your maintenance, repair, organization, overhaul, and so on from within your own resources makes the whole enterprise much more cost effective. So by sticking to the companies that are Indian companies producing drones or any defense equipment for Indian companies, is sort of not just makes for better optics, but also becomes cheaper. So I think that to say that this will ensure that the companies then start building their own drones is merely one leap of logic from the earlier point that I just made, which is that the companies will realize that there is a ready market in India from the Indian military units for buying from these drones and other weapon systems, and they will that will encourage them to produce more, to spend more on research and development, and to build up generally an Indian defense industry. So there are 4 or 5 reasons that come together really to sort of advocate for indigenous capabilities and indigenous manufacture, and that's the dynamic that is at play in India right now.
So Ajay, ever since the breakout of the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen a lot of commentary in media, and I've seen a lot of discussion on this issue that somehow the Russian weapons are either not reliable, or B, that Russia is so absorbed in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine that, ultimately its demand is going to be, needed at home or in Ukraine, then it would be able to supply to the international market. If such a situation like this is going to force India to look elsewhere other than Russia, how do you see such an eventuality affecting India's decades-long reliance on Russia?
That's a sort of a very valid question. And it's a question that Indian policymakers have been grappling with for quite some years now. The United States supply of weaponry, let's just put that aside for one moment and look at just what India's reliance was on the Russian equipment. At the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, Usama, India was dependent on Russia for almost its entire Air Force requirements, almost its entire Navy requirements, its entire armored vehicle fleet, its entire air defense weapons fleet. India essentially was relying on Russia for more than 80% of its defense requirements. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and all these production units, design bureaus, and basically the whole Russian defense industry, when it collapsed along with the rest of the Soviet Union, India was in a dire situation as far as its weaponry requirements were concerned. So I think that the lesson that was drawn from those dire days were really that we cannot possibly allow ourselves to be in a position of such acute dependency again, especially given the fact that the Russians have displayed and completely sort of placed in front of you on a platter their inability to sort of supply equipment to the Indian armed forces. China at that time sort of made an absolute killing by hiring a large number of Russian scientists and designers and taking them to China and building up essentially the Chinese defense industry with that. But India did not do that as well. So I think that the sort of Russian dependency will never be allowed to sort of dominate the Indian defense market again. India has not just this example, but also the fact that a lot of the foreign weaponry that has come in since then, you look at transport aircraft, you look at the C-130 Special Forces aircraft and so on. These are such excellent weapons platforms that the Indian military has sort of really started asking itself the question, why were we denying ourselves access to these platforms in the past? So I think it's a combination of many events. Russia has own requirements which they're not being able to meet to sort of prosecute the Ukrainian war. The fact that Russian designers and so on are tied up in meeting Russian requirements. All these are factors that along with the larger strategic factor, which is that India would be multi-aligned and not aligned with just one country or two countries. All these factors come together to militate for India placing its reliance on a larger number of countries rather than just the Soviet Union.
So would you see India's reliance on Russia then reducing or diminishing altogether in the years to come?
I think that we are too far down that path to actually just start walking back to the start point. India will continue to be reliant on Russian equipment for some time. Things like tanks and armored personnel carriers and mechanized air defense platforms and so on. These cannot just be, put aside and replaced with other countries' weaponry. So India will continue to be reliant on Russian equipment for some time, but that reliance will gradually recede. The Indian domestic production plus the supply from foreign countries other than Russia will come and gradually take over sections of that. And at the end of it, you will find a far more balanced force posture on the Indian side.
Okay, Ajay, now moving on to our last question. The top U.S. diplomat for East Asia, Daniel Kritenbrink, said yes when asked, would India be playing a greater role or a growing role in South China Sea? Apart from, selling arms and gifting ships and playing a legacy rescue and relief operations in that region, how else do you see Indian Navy's role growing over there?
Usama, this is a question that the Indian Navy chief has answered at least 4 or 5 times in the last 4 or 5 years. Every Navy day, some journalist like you or me, get up and ask him, are you going to be playing a role in the South China Sea? And consistently, the Navy chief has said, no, India has no role in the South China Sea. India has a role in protecting global commons in the Indian Ocean region. The sea lines of communication that go from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca are sea lines of communication that we will protect against piracy, against terrorism. We will ensure that these sea lanes remain open, but we will not go into the South China Sea for the simple reason that we don't see a role that we have to play over there. Indeed, if you think about it dispassionately, there are already too many navies in the South China Sea for my liking. There's the Chinese Navy, of course, which is trying to sort of extend its domination over that area. There is the four quad navies are over there. Yes, India, the Australian Navy, the Japanese, the US Navy, and now they've sort of got this grouping called AUKUS, which is Australia, UK, and the United States. These three powers are also saying that they will play a role over there. The Indian Navy is a medium-sized navy compared to China and compared to the US Navy. So there is a limited extent to the role that it can play in that area. Is also a fact, and this needs to be understood by many of our armchair warriors. When you are operating close to your bases, when you are operating close to your home ports, then a navy can be sort of easily sustained. It can appear to be very powerful, and the Indian Navy's 140 to 150 ships will indeed exert a great deal of influence in the Indian Ocean region. But you take the same number of ships and move them 1,000 kilometers away into the South China Sea, and you will suddenly find that their power and their influence diminishes. They can play a much smaller role when they are that far from their home base. So just as China's Navy would play a limited role in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy will play such a limited role in the Chinese context in South China Sea that India's planners will most probably reach the conclusion that it's better to keep our navy in this area and let it be responsible for the Indian Ocean region. And we don't really have much of a role in the South China Sea or the Western Pacific.
So Ajay, your last thoughts on this. So despite being a part of the Quad, you presume, or your assessment is that despite being part of the Quad, India is only likely to stick to the traditional role it has so far up until now. That is to sell arms, that is to, provide rescue and relief operations as it has done previously in the region when the tsunami struck it. So you think beyond that, there's not much of a military role of the Indian Navy or India itself over there?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that while I agree with the first part of what you said, while in the Indian Navy would confine itself in physical terms to these waters that are close to its own bases, it is playing a very valuable role for the Quad and for the AUKUS by doing so, because safeguarding the commons here and safeguarding these waters against sort of benign influences is a very important part of what the Quad would like to sort of see itself doing and the credit that it wants to see itself getting. So the Indian Navy will continue to be a part of the Quad. It will play a role for the Quad, but that role will take place and be played in the Indian Ocean region, where the Navy is, at its sort of powerful best and able to exert influence.
Sorry to interject you, Ajay. I meant particularly in South China Sea.
No, in the South China Sea, the Indian Navy would be sort of diminishing its own role by moving its warships there and hoping to take on, other navies' warships which are closer to their bases and therefore in a much more powerful situation.
Thank you, Ajay. It was really a pleasure having you over for this podcast. Thank you once again for taking out the time.
Thank you, Usama. I think that we really need to have more of these dialogues between India and Pakistan so that there is less misunderstanding between the two sides and more sort of realization of why sort of certain roles are being taken on by other countries and so on. It is not always a malign sort of influence that is causing it.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Mr. Ajai Shukla. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you'd like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.